Is it affordable to get it all the way to Euston?
We'll be making an announcement on that soon, but it certainly doesn't it would never have made sense to leave it between Old Oak Common and Birmingham.
Welcome to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast. I'm Christian Walmer, an author and journalist who has covered transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we try to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments, and interviews in the transport world. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades looking at transport policies and legislation. So, Mark, what are we covering today?
Hello, Christian, and hello to our listeners. We're going to be examining the many faceted problems of London's Euston Station in today's podcast, including what might happen in relation to HS2 and also some of the more contemporary challenges. Later on, we'll also be looking at the position on bike hire schemes, particularly the Lime bike scheme, which has become especially controversial of late. And then finally, we'll be taking a look at developments with the UK government's road building programme.
Euston is rather interesting because there's both a short-term problem and a long-term problem. And the short-term problem is particularly pressing. It's become quite a big issue with, articles in the papers, BBC covering and so on. And you've been rather surprised by the fact that the Transport Secretary herself has been involved in this.
Yes, it was a case over the last few weeks. You almost couldn't, we don't pick up a paper now, do we? But look at the sort of
website
homepage of a newspaper's website. And without there being a story there that had something to do with Euston Station. And this all seemed to crystallise around the issue of the departure board at Euston Station and the fact that in order to manage the passenger flows and the crowds in a more efficient and perhaps safer way, Network Rail, as the operator of this major station, had moved away from that magnificent departure board which had sort of straddled the whole concourse for decades. Instead put smaller departure boards scattered around the building, but then
floating boards. They're called floating boards.
Floating boards. Thank you very much for that technical explanation. But then, curiously, had replaced the huge departure board with a giant electronic advertising hoarding. That's as I understand the position. And it was the advertising hoarding that had become extremely controversial and provoked the Secretary of State for Transport, Louise Haigh, to exercise her powers as what she would call the passenger-in-chief, essentially to tell Network Rail to turn it off. Is that the correct reporting of the position, Christian?
Yes, that's right. I mean, that's quite extraordinary, isn't it? I do see Graham Eccles, who's a long-time railway person who used to run Southwest trains, actually tweeted something to the fact that this was actually unprecedented. A Secretary of State getting involved with what is a relatively minor matter of it's seen as kind of passenger safety because of the dangers of the rush of people. But it was also, one has to point out, she's dead right. I mean, the replacement of the huge departure information kind of across all the platforms and replacing that with a floating one means that everybody hangs about. The floating one has two sides to it. So they're all hanging around, kind of looking up right in the middle of the station. So they're blocking every other entrance and exit. And there's also this odd kind of design thing that to get to the underground station, you have to kind of exit the station and then come back in again. I mean, which is kind of completely bizarre. and the same if you want to enter the station from the underground station, you walk out and in. So there's some bizarre changes which Network Rail has created, which do seem to have been a mistake. But then, of course, this has also been the subject of a very public row between Gareth Dennis, the journalist, and Peter Hendy, who, as chairman of Network Rail, had a spat with Gareth Dennis over the fact that Gareth Dennis had said that this was unsafe, which was probably a bit exaggerated, although, it does seem to be that many other people have now joined in saying it was unsafe. And Peter Hendy intervened in this as Network Rail chairman. And now, and eventually, Gareth Dennis, who also worked for an engineering company called Sistra, was actually then dismissed as a result of his outspoken comments. So I think this is one of the reasons why there's been so much coverage, because it's sort of a way of getting at the Labour government, given that Peter Hendy is now a minister in that government. So it's gone up the agenda. I mean, personally, I don't think it is unsafe, but it's very uncomfortable. I mean, as somebody who goes to football matches, when you take a train there, it is a bit like a football crowd, and there's no reason to think that there's going to be some massive crush or something, because that could be averted. But it's certainly needs remedying. And Network Rail have now got a several-point plan, a 5-point plan to investigate it. But all this is taking place while HS2 is possibly creeping towards Euston.
Well, indeed, but before we talk about HS2, you're a great historian of the railways, and it's fair to say, isn't it, that Euston, with its sort of 1960s brutalist design, was intended to be almost the exact opposite of the traditional railway terminus, wasn't it? And to operate more like an airport terminal. Was that the thinking?
Absolutely right. And with the kind of the slopes towards the stations being kind of rather like kind of ramps onto aeroplanes. And famously, I'm old enough to remember this, unfortunately. Famously, there were no seats. There was nowhere to sit at all and wait for trains.
Yeah.
And they did eventually put some seats in, but the fact that that's pretty half-hearted, and the seats are kind of lodged around the outside and stuff, and it's really one huge warehouse for people.
But also, Christian, what's happened, I think, over the decades, as I've observed, is there's gradually been more and more retail has crept onto the concourse, hasn't it? And so whereas it was a kind of big open space, as you say, for warehousing people until the trains were ready to leave, now there's lots of kind of retail activity going on as well, which has kind of just maybe confused the way that the movement of people occurs in that building.
And numbers, of course, have gone up.
Of course, yeah.
And then the train service has been, what could one say about Avanti's train service? Stuttering is probably the right word. That so as has been said by many people, it's fine when everything is okay, but once there's delays and cancellations and the like, and everybody's trying to look up at this floating departure information, there is also one outside, actually, which is fine when the weather's okay, but otherwise it's terrible. And one would have thought that when they redesigned it, they could have extended the covered bit outside, covered the whole outside, got rid of the retail outside, and actually double the concourse space for the cost of putting up a roof, actually, and that would have solved an awful lot of the problems. But there's obviously a reluctance to spend money on it because it is due to be rebuilt.
Of course, and that brings us back to the position around HS2 and the fact that so much of the, should we say, the character of that neighbourhood at the moment, and it's important to me because it's my old family neighbourhood, but so much of the character of that neighbourhood is influenced by what is not happening with HS2 at present.
let me just say something about that, actually, Mark, because I cycle down what's called Hampstead Road, which goes from Camden Town to Euston quite often. And it is a disgrace. I mean, it is really a scandal that there is this vast kind of, size of 40 or 50 football fields space that has been completely cleared of a decent council estate, of a hotel, of the old Temperance Hospital, various other buildings, completely cleared before they had any idea of what they were going to build there. They're like, let's demolish all this, because if we demolish all this, something will have to happen. And of course now nothing is happening, and nothing will happen for several years. And it is really depressing. It's like going back to my childhood days when there were lots of bomb sites. I mean, it is a scandal that this whole area where work has stopped now 18 months ago or something, and is not going to happen for several years. And we await kind of some plan to emerge. There isn't even the notion of a plan.
Now, you've been writing about HS2 in relation to Euston and what needs to be done there to pick up from the kind of pause button that was pushed by the Conservative government a year ago. But of course, they pushed the stop button when it came to HS2 north of Birmingham. But there are ideas, quite serious ideas now, circulating and apparently being considered by the government for some kind of alternative to HS2 north of Birmingham.
Right. And so there's two bits to this. Yes, I wrote a piece for the Spectator, which was entitled, Can HS2 be fixed? And, as a lot of people will know, I've been a long opponent of HS2, but, having built so much of it already, and 10-mile tunnels underneath the Chilterns, which you and I have visited, and the 2-mile viaduct over the Colne Valley, and all sorts of other bits of infrastructure, it can't be abandoned. So it has to be finished between what I've called the Acton to Aston shuttle. But the Acton to Aston shuttle is useless as a piece of infrastructure. So it has to continue. So there's two bits to this. It has to continue to Euston, which involves two large bits of expenditure, the tunnelling, and it does seem that the government is minded to give that. It's giving a lot of hints that it's going to do that. And certainly it will need Rachel Reeves to agree that they can borrow more money to invest in infrastructure to do that. But then, so that's maybe 4 or 5 billion to get to Euston. And then there's the additional problem, what to do with Euston, where the last estimate for a station there, well, it was 10 platform station, was 4 billion. They're now talking of possibly a 6 platform station, but then that would mean that there wouldn't be enough capacity to run trains to all the original destinations and so on. And it is a total mess. But then we get the second mess, where, again, you and I have been to Curzon Street, in Birmingham, where they're finishing the viaduct, they're finishing the bridges that we visited, but they haven't really made a start on Curzon Street Station. And then there's a question of, whether at the junction where Birmingham International Station will be, how they're going to continue it up to Handsacre, which is the junction with the Great West, with the West Coast Main Line. That is going to be completed. But then what happens north of there is another big question. So, as I wrote in the Spectator piece, I mean, they're really stuck between a rock and a hard place. The government is really stuck between a rock and a hard place because, they're going to be forced to spend money on all these things. I think ultimately, to make any sense at all of this project, it has to run from Euston to Manchester. And that involves, considerable expenditure. So the idea, as I set out in the Spectator piece, is that somehow they'll get the private sector involved. So no longer will HS2 Limited build this, but there'll be some new private sector consortium with a kind of tighter budgetary constraints, with an incentive to stick within that budget, and so on. But Mark, we've been here before. Getting private companies to stick to budgets on schemes like this is always difficult, and it's no guarantee that it won't overrun. And then the two solutions that are then presented is that either the state would buy back this new section of HS2, which would not necessarily be built to the same fast standards. It's HS2 Light, it's been called. Or then the operator, which would have to then pay track access charges. And so those are the only two ways that the private sector could be reimbursed. Neither of those, as I've suggested in my piece, will really be kind of good news to a transport secretary who's busy renationalising the train operations and the franchises. So then she's going to be forced to use private sector money to build HS2. It's all a little bit kind of politically embarrassing, don't you think?
Well, it's certainly complicated, isn't it?
I'm sorry, I'm at length
as transport policy in this country always seems to be. And of course, there's also, returning to Euston, where we started, there is this extraordinary historical accident that Euston happens to be located in the parliamentary constituency of our Prime Minister as well.
Yes, all that mass of empty space. That is used to where his constituents live. And it is noticeable that he didn't do very well in the election in his own constituency, actually. He lost some of his majority. So, it's going to look a bit, you can imagine the right-wing press getting onto this. Oh, he's going to, spend a lot of money getting to Euston because, it's an embarrassment to Starmer and he's going to get his own station. I mean, you can see quite a lot of negative publicity. On the other hand, leaving it as a desert for, the next 20 years is not feasible. You can't do that. So, again, rock in a hard place is the obvious expression.
Before we leave our exploration of Euston Station, I just think it's worth mentioning that it's been, again, for some coincidental reason, in the public mind for other circumstances lately, because, of course, many of us have enjoyed the BBC drama Nightsleeper that was actually made by a company called Euston Films. And covered the fictional hijacking of a sleeper train leaving Glasgow on its overnight journey to London Euston. And you've enjoyed this as well, haven't you, Christian?
I've had some laughs at it. I mean, the idea that a train could be started off. I'm not spoiling the plot here.
No spoilers. We promise no spoilers.
The idea that a train could be started remotely on its own is not really feasible, because as even the kind of person least interested in trains knows, that you do need a dead man's handle, or dead man's pedal as it really is, pressed down to enable the train to move forward. And once that handle or pedal is released, the train stops. And there's all sorts of other ridiculous notions going on in this film, but it's a good laugh, great fun. And yes, it's supposed to end up in Euston, but apparently I haven't quite seen the end, but apparently it doesn't. It ends up in another state.
No, but we can't we can't spoil it for our listeners, and also it does have some without a spoiler as well. I think listeners who do get to the end will notice an echo from another famous railway movie in one of the last scenes, but I won't say any more than that. Christian, you're one of the country's keenest cyclists, but one aspect of cycling that's been in the news of late is the hire scheme operated by a company called Lime.
Yes, indeed. And I must say, in London, and I think in some other cities around the country, but particularly in London, Lime bikes, which are actually lime coloured, have become ubiquitous. I mean, I would estimate that, there's a lot of cyclists in London, but something like 10 or 15% of the cyclists use these lime bikes, and they become more popular than the Santander bikes, which the big difference being that they are docked. You have to start and end the journey on at some particular docking station. The Lime bikes, which again, the big difference is they're all electrified. Some Santander bikes are now getting electric power, but basically most of them are pedal powered, whereas the Lime bikes are all pedal assisted. Now they don't whiz along unless you pedal, and they're limited to 15 miles an hour by the electric aid, but you can go downhill faster if you're pedaling like mad. They're very heavy, they're quite clunky, but they have become really a feature. There's one parked outside my house at the moment as I speak, because my grandson, who is age 13, I'm not sure whether he's legal or not, but he's got an account and he pays for it, and he uses them quite regularly. And this shows that they are going to be a feature of our transport system, I think, for quite a long time. There were some other bike hire schemes that didn't work, Mobikes and some other bikes which were dockless bikes, which weren't electric, and which too many of them ended up in canals or whatever. Somehow this one is surviving. They're not particularly cheap to use. I rode one the other day to Euston station, which is about 3 miles away. Cost me £5, so it's not particularly cheap. Now, the big controversy is that they do get left in inconvenient places, and people with poor eyesight or basically pushing trolleys and stuff, or pushing children, are finding it sometimes that they get in the way, and it's a hassle. And one council, the council leader in Brent, has threatened Lime Bike and said, if you don't sort this issue out, we're going to ban them. Now, my view is that you can't put the horse back in the stable, or you can't basically stop the use of Lime bikes. They have become very popular and important. I think they are a good way of getting people to use their bikes, or getting bikes. Maybe, you use a Lime bike and you realize how convenient this is, and you start using your own bike. It's just a very convenient way to get around. I mean, for me, although I have my own bike, sometimes I don't want to leave my bike for a day or so in some place where I'm just taking a journey to, so I just cycle there and on a Lime bike. So it's an incredibly useful new part of the transport infrastructure, here to stay. It will expand into all sorts of other companies. The company claims they're profitable. I don't know if that's the case yet, but they're certainly claiming they're profitable. And I expect them to survive. So we need policies to deal with them. Possibly they need to be licensed more strictly. Maybe they need a deal with the local council. Maybe they need to pay money to the local council. Maybe the council needs to have powers to enforce bad parking. You could, but you might need new legislation for this, and so on. But so it's a very interesting ongoing issue, but I think largely a positive story.
See, you're much more sympathetic to all these micro mobility technologies than perhaps I am, because if I'm not using public transport, my principal mode of travel is my own 2 feet. I'm a pedestrian.
Shanks' pony, yes.
I'm a pedestrian, and I find in recent years it's almost been like the Wild West, really, with these various technologies that have found their way onto our streets, many of which, I mean, for example, the personally owned scooters are illegal, and yet they are, as you say, ubiquitous. They're everywhere, and most of the time they seem to be ridden by people who've got none of the required safety equipment that's recommended, and they're riding on the pavement a lot of the time as well. And then we have the problem of the kind of supercharged e-bikes, not the higher bikes, but again, the privately owned ones that people have effectively turned into electric motorcycles that they're riding around in a completely unregulated way. So
and not pedaling. They're terrifying. Those they go about 30 miles an hour. They're very heavy. Lots of them have these little Vespa-type wheels, and they're not pedalled at all. And they just whiz along at kind of great speed. Yes, no, I agree. They're quite scary.
And plus all the fire hazards that we've seen associated with the batteries on many of these vehicles, which are causing all sorts of problems for people that are when they're being recharged in homes, and particularly in blocks of flats. And in fact, they're banned from being carried on public transport for that very reason, because they constitute a fire hazard. So I suppose what I think it was mentioned briefly in Parliament today during transport questions that the new government does plan to introduce some kind of legislation to govern these micro mobility technologies. But even that's no good unless there's enforcement to make sure that the illegal vehicles or the illegal use of vehicles is actually dealt with.
Yes, you are a bit Luddite about this, Mark.
I admit it.
And you're putting the pedestrian's point of view, which is perfectly reasonable, and you're pointing out some dangers. Actually, the fire hazard is only really when these are people buy the wrong batteries for them, or they buy batteries that don't meet the regulations. The proper batteries generally don't have a problem, but that doesn't reduce the problem. People are being killed by these things by leaving them charging overnight and then in corridors, and then burning their houses down, and several people have died as a result. So they do need to be dealt with. But I just want to counter your Luddism slightly by saying, these are not going to go away. We've had several iterations of this. As I say, they've had various hire bike schemes that have just disappeared because they ended up in canals, and some have just gone the way of fax machines. They weren't quite the right kind of model. But I might be wrong, but I just think that line bikes are here to stay. So, I think they need to be properly legislated for, and maybe that's something that the government ought to be looking at.
Here's Christian's final thought from the Departure Lounge.
Well, there's been a lot of pressure we've seen on the roads budget, particularly the budget for new roads, which a lot of people within the Labour Party and certainly the Green Party want to see as a potential way of transferring funds to more sustainable forms of transport. And the latest expression of this is the fact that a decision over the Lower Thames Crossing, which is our new tunnel underneath the Thames, that is supposed to relieve pressure on the Dartford crossing. The decision has been delayed until, would you believe, May the 23rd, which is nearly 8 months away, which is quite extraordinary delay. It's a £9 billion scheme. They've already spent nearly £300 million just preparing the planning application for it, which just shows that we're never going to get anything built in this country at all if people have to go through these hoops. Now, as it happens, I oppose this scheme. I think it would be a big mistake for Labour to go ahead with it, given its emphasis on net zero, sustainable transport, and the like. And we've already seen in London there's a kind of parallel thing that Sadiq Khan gave the go-ahead some time ago to the Silvertown Tunnel. And that seems to be in contradiction of a lot of his other policies, which favour sustainable travel and cycling, walking and public transport and the like. So it would be very odd if the government gave that go-ahead to this, particularly if it then isn't going to fund some major transport schemes, such as the route to Euston for HS2. So watch this space, but I would put money on the fact that the Lower Thames Crossing is dead.
Calling All Stations, the transport podcast with Christian Walmart, is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do also follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter, Our handle is @AllStationsPod.